Today we've got a Masonic Bible, and I'm just going to read the introduction. This is published in 1928, so probably printed between 1928 and maybe 1958 at the latest. Greetings, my dear brother. With a knowledge of the Holy Bible and of Shakespeare, a man's education may be said to be complete, someone has said. Whether or not this statement can be taken at its full face value, the Holy Bible still continues to be the world's bestseller, and generation after generation have found help, inspiration, and courage in its perusal. So, my brother, as Masonic teachings are drawn so largely from this book, we take pleasure in inscribing in this way the hope that you too will find comfort in its teachings and incentive to nobler living all the days of your earthly life. May you enter proudly into the fellowship of educated men and stalwart Masons. Fraternally yours, Frank M. Ton is what the last name. I can't really read the cursive, but there you go. Brother, initiated, passed, raised, WM, SWJW secretary. Not sure what all that means. And it's got some notes at the beginning. Received by, met by, raised by fellow candidates, visiting brethren and friends. Notes, the Holy Bible in Freemasonry. Copyrighted by Board of General Activities, Grand Lodge, F&AM, 1928, printed in the United States. The Holy Bible in Freemasonry. Masonic tradition represents, among other things, a pilgrimage begun in gloom and ended in glory. In common with animate creatures and growing plants, man from earliest infancy instinctively turns from darkness to seek the light, to seek more light, to seek further light. This is as natural to him as breathing. Light is a fundamental requirement for the health of his body, for the well-being of his mind, and the welfare of his soul. He is rarely so savage or primitive as not to welcome it as a fulfillment of some mystical impulse, welling up from the secret depths of his heart. In an early stage of his intellectual and spiritual advancement, he prostrates himself in reverence before the sun, adores the moon, venerates the stars, worships flames which his own hands have kindled. For him, evil rides in the clouds which blacken the sky, in the impenetrable shadows of eclipse, in nighttime, in the darkness of forest or cavern. Goodness and joy come surging in upon him from the eastern sky, borne on swift wheels by the chariots of the dawn. This inborn craving for light is a simple fact of human experience. Freemasonry has taken full cognizance thereof, making of the fact a keystone for that vast arc of allegory, symbol, emblem, and rite which supports the fraternity's whole superstructure. Through a natural development, the Holy Bible has come to be the chief symbol of that light. Other symbols there are, but this is most important of them all. At a certain stage of that strange journey which all brethren and fellows must make, the neophyte discovers that his craving for light has become irresistible, no longer to be denied or repressed. It is then, for the first time in his Masonic career, he beholds radiance emanating from that volume of the sacred law which regular Freemasonry keeps forever upon its altars. But then, for the first time, he learns that Freemasonry has three great lights, but that the greatest of these is the Holy Bible. By regular Freemasonry is meant all ancient craft masonry, recognized as legitimate by the 49 Grand Lodges of the United States, by the various Grand Lodges of the British Commonwealth of Nations, and by those other Grand Lodges and concordant orders to which these extend fraternal recognition. It comprises 97% of all persons in the world calling themselves Freemasons. It is partly because the remaining 3% have forsaken the great light and repudiated the sovereignty of the grand architect of the universe that they are regarded by regular Masons as being irregular and clandestine Freemasons with whom lawful Masonic intercourse may not be held. The presence or absence in a Masonic lodge of the volume of the sacred law is therefore within itself a test of regularity. By a dualism of significance not uncommon in the Masonic system, the Bible is not only a great light, it is part also of the indispensable furniture of a lodge. A regular Freemason may not lawfully sit, even as a guest, in a lodge which does not open the Bible on its altar. Its presence there is as essential to lawful Masonic work is in quotation marks, as is a charter or dispensation from some grand body of competent jurisdiction. Until the book has been opened in due form, a lodge may not lawfully proceed to business. After the book has been closed, no transaction of the lodge as a lodge is binding upon its members. Over and over again, by one grand jurisdiction after another, legislative action has confirmed this traditional significance of the volume of the sacred law. Some have gone so far as to declare that it is one of the ancient landmarks, those ancient, irrevocable, and unrepealable bases of Masonic common law, which have existed from time immemorial, and which no Grand Lodge or set of Grand Lodges has power to change. Whether this is correct as applied strictly and solely to the Bible is somewhat in dispute among students of Masonic jurisprudence. Debate there is as to whether the volume of the sacred law of immemorial tradition is the whole Bible, or the particular canon of Scripture comprehended within the King James Version, or perhaps only some part of it. There is question as to how far lodges of Muslims, or Hindus, or Parsis, or Chinese may lawfully go in substituting for the Bible the holy books of their own religions, as the Quran, the Upanishads, the Analects, the Zend Avesta. There are those who hold that even where these are employed in administering the oaths of initiation, the Bible also must be present. This is a discussion, however, the importance of which is academic rather than practical. So far as the great majority of working lodges is concerned, there is neither question nor difficulty. By well-established custom, the volume of the sacred law is for them the Holy Bible. Moreover, it is the canon of the authorized version of the Holy Bible for all but a few. In all the world, so far as could be ascertained by the Grand Secretary, Grand Lodge of New York, as of July 1st, 1928, there were approximately 4,400,000 men enrolled as members of regular lodges. Of these, all but about 300,000 were working in the English language and naturally used the English Bible. Regular Masons working in other tongues used translations in those tongues. Freemasonry and religion. It is often said of Freemasonry that it is not a religion, but that it is religious. Its only religious dogma, if indeed it can be called a dogma, is that belief in a supreme being, grand architect of the universe, is essential to the admittance into the fraternity. Although it insists upon the open Bible in the lodge, it does not attempt to interpret the scriptures to its membership. To prevent discord and the jar of sect against sect, it forbids under the severest penalties all sectarian discussion in its lodge rooms. In monitorial language, the fraternity addresses such words as these to its initiates. The great light in Masonry is the Holy Bible. Howsoever men differ in creed and theology, all good men are agreed that within the covers of the Holy Bible are found those principles of morality which lay the foundations upon which to build a righteous life. Freemasonry therefore opens this book upon its altars with the command to each of its votaries that he diligently study therein to learn the way to everlasting life, adopting no particular creed, forbidding sectarian discussion within her lodge rooms, encouraging each to be steadfast in the faith of his acceptance. Freemasonry takes all good men by the hand, and, leading them to her altars, points to the open Bible thereon, and urges upon each that he faithfully direct his steps through life by the light he there shall find, and as he there shall find it. If from our sacred altars the atheist, the infidel, the irreligious man, or the libertine should ever be able to wrest this book of sacred laws and thus remove or even obscure the greatest light in Masonry, that light which has for centuries been the rule and guide of Freemasons, we then could no longer claim for ourselves the great rank and title of free and accepted Masons. But so long as that sacred light shines upon our altars, so long as it illuminates the pathway of the craftsman by the golden rays of truth, so long and no longer can Freemasonry live and shed its beneficent influence upon mankind. Various other statements of this general idea have appeared from time to time. A concise and widely accepted statement of the Masonic attitude towards religious questions in general is found in the following preamble to the Constitution of the Grand Lodge of New York. As an expression of the simplest form of the faith of Masonry, not exhaustive, but incontrovertible and suggestive, the following is the Masonic belief. There is one God, the Father of all men. The Holy Bible is the great light in Masonry, and the rule and guide for faith and practice. Man is immortal. Character determines destiny. Love of man is next to love of God, man's first duty. Prayer, communion of man with God, is helpful. Recognizing the impossibility of confining the teaching of Masonry to any fixed forms of expression, yet acknowledging the value of authoritative statements of fundamental principles, the following is proclaimed as the Masonic teaching. Masonry teaches man to practice charity and benevolence, to practice or to protect chastity, to respect the ties of blood and friendship, to adopt the principles and revere the ordinances of religion, to assist the feeble, guide the blind, raise up the downtrodden, shelter the orphan, guard the altar, support the government, inculcate morality, promote learning, love man, fear God, implore his mercy, and hope for happiness. On this broad platform, Masonry promotes friendships among right-thinking men of every creed, sect, and opinion. Each is assured of complete liberty of conscience. All believers in the ever-living and true God, however various their individual conceptions of him may be, may join hands around the altar of the fraternity. Modernist and fundamentalist, Christian and Jew, Hindu and Muslim, meet there upon a common plane as brothers all. With what particular understanding any of them may venerate the volume of the sacred law, Freemasonry has no concern, providing it is venerated. It only insists that as each receives therefrom such light as he is capable of receiving, He shall not seek to obscure or distort the vision which may come to his brother Mason. Departure by any lodge or Grand Lodge from the minimum requirement of belief in the Grand Architect of the universe, or the refusal of any lodge or Grand Lodge to maintain the open volume of the sacred law upon its altar, means prompt severance of Masonic relations between the offending body and the mass of regular Masonry. How the Bible became a great light. Historical research discloses that the present position of the Bible in the Masonic system came about through a long course of steady development. From the earliest times of which there is a written record, there cannot be any doubt that biblical lore has always dwelt at the heart and center of Masonic thought. The fraternity's most ancient legends are inextricably interwoven with Old Testament narrative. Some part, if not all, of the Bible appears to have been used at initiatory ceremonies, or at least in the conferring of obligations far back in the Middle Ages. Nevertheless, it is clear that the practice of regarding the book objectively as one of the craft's most important symbols did not rise until somewhere toward the middle of the 18th century. The literature of operative Freemasonry prior to the formation of the English Grand Lodge in 1717 is more extensive than was for long believed possible. Prior to 1717, English lodges of operative Masons did not recognize the authority of any single governing body. In the years 1716 and 1717, at least 4 old lodges meeting in London formed the first Grand Lodge of England, choosing Anthony Sayer as first Grand Master. All historic regular Freemasonry dates from this period. The new Grand Lodge took over from the older and independent operative body's actual control of craft Masonry. The change of 1717 is regarded by Masonic scholars as the beginning of the modern era of speculative Freemasonry. All regular grand jurisdictions now trace their Masonic authority to that series of events. It consists in the main of various ancient, so this is speaking of the literature of operative Freemasonry, consists in the main of various ancient manuscripts. Upwards of 100 of these have come to light in one way or another, the oldest apparently being one commonly ascribed to about 1390 and known as the Regius poem. It is in the custody of the British Museum. These venerable documents demonstrate that the medieval English Masons were Christian and Trinitarian, Orthodox believers in the Church, which was for them, as for all other English Christians of their day, the Church universal, divine, holy, one, and indivisible. It would have been extraordinary to find open Bibles in their lodges at that time, for the simple reason that the Bible was then jealously guarded in the exclusive custody of the Church, a closed book to common men, few of whom had the skill to read it, even if it had occurred to them to challenge the Church's assumption of sole authority of interpretation. Most of the manuscripts begin with a pious invocation of the Holy Trinity and abound with admonitions of the loyalty due to established religion. This is true of the Regius poem, which describes the ideal craftsman as one who most love well God and Holy Church Algate, and his Meister also that he is with. The poem ends with these lines: Christ then of his high grace give you both wit and space, well this boke to Kana and Rede. I'm guessing that means in older English, it shall be good to come and read this book, heaven to have for your meed, and mead I believe means food. Amen, amen, so mote height be, so must it be, or so it might be. Say we Allah PR charity. I'm not sure what PR stands for, but that's a little old English for you. And on to the next page. Whether this book, meant the poem itself or some part of the Holy Scriptures is not necessary to inquire at the present moment. The lines at least testify to the Christian piety of the operative Masons of those faraway times, more than 100 years before Columbus began his voyage of discovery to America. Nearly all of the ancient writings give in one form or another the old legend of the craft. This is the famous tradition which associates the beginnings of Masonry with the beginnings of what was then known of human history. It is of importance to the present discussion to observe that these legends would be unintelligible without considerable knowledge of the Old Testament. At some point in all the manuscripts, the narrative gets around to the conventional account of how new Masons were obligated, when, almost without exception, they give one of several variations of this Latin rubric. Tunc unus ex senioribus teniat librum illi qui jussu jurandum redat, et ponet manum libro vel sub librum dum articuli et precepta sibi legantur. One of the more modern manuscripts gives the rubric in this English form. One of the eldest taking the Bible shall hold it forth that he or they which are to be made Masons may impose and lay their right hand upon it, and the charge shall be read. Which is interesting, because there is no Latin equivalent of Mason, and the word that they're translating as Bible is librum, which again just means book, so it could theoretically be any book. And senioribus is one of the eldest, taking the book shall hold it forth, and ponet manum, the man with the book. Yeah, I don't see anything, the word Mason there, so that's interesting. Continuing on, whether the librum of the Latin, the boke or buca of other manuscripts, and the Bible of this form were always the same thing, has occasioned dispute among scholars. A comparatively modern text expressly says the allusion is to the Holy Scripture. The weight of critical opinion inclines to a belief that medieval lodges used the Bible or the Gospels, or at least one Gospel, when swearing in new members. An inventory of the London Company of Masons, taken on July 4th, 1676, which is an interesting date. That's also the American date of independence. I'll continue. Shows among the valued possessions of that ancient body one great Bible, one book of common prayer, and one book of the constitutions of the accepted Masons. With the formation of the Grand Lodge in 1717, the character of Freemasonry underwent important modifications. From that time on, strict Trinitarianism has given place to that universality of religious outlook which is such a striking peculiarity of the fraternity today. The transition was, let me read that again. The transition was signaled or signalized in a passage concerning God and religion which first occurred in Anderson's Constitutions of 1723. A Mason is obliged by his tenure to obey the moral law, and if he rightly understands the art, he never will be a stupid atheist, nor a irreligious libertine. But though in ancient times Masons were charged in every country to be of the religion of that country or nation, whatever it was, yet 'tis now thought more expedient only to oblige them to that religion in which all men agree, leaving their particular opinions to themselves, that is, to be good men and true, or men of honor and honesty, by whatever denominations or persuasions they may be distinguished, whereby Masonry becomes the center of union and the means of conciliating true friendship among persons that must have remained at a perpetual distance. What position the Bible held in lodge ritual at this stage of Masonic history is not clear. In a postscript attached to Anderson's Constitutions, the manner of constituting new lodges is described. The Grand Master or his deputy is therein required to transmit to the master of the lodge the constitutions, the lodge book, and the instruments of his office, but no mention of the Bible is included. Yet an old lodge book of 1721 records the installation of the Duke of Montague as Grand Master, saying that he solemnly swore with his right hand on the holy evangelists. A catechism entitled The Mystery of Freemasons, published in 1730, describes a form of obligation in which square and compass were to be touched as sacred objects, but says nothing of the Bible. But Pritchard, in Masonry Dissected, published in the same year, speaks of an oath taken on the Bible, square and compass, and later calls these three symbols furniture of the lodge, explaining them much as modern monitors do. The Dumfries Kilwinning manuscript, number 4, published, it is believed, at about the same time, describes the Bible, square and compass, as the three pillars of the lodge. Pope Clement XII, in his bill interdicting Freemasonry, published April 18, 1738, argued as one of his complaints against the society that its members with private ceremonies enjoin and bind themselves as well by strict oath taken on the Bible as by the imprecation of heavy punishments to preserve with inviolable secrecy, etc. Old lodge records indicate by sparse allusions that appropriations of money to buy Bibles were by no means infrequent. Some of these books were destined to become historic. Notable among these is the Old Bible of St. John's Lodge in Boston, which was presented by Lord Colville, Deputy Grand Master, in 1752. Even more celebrated is the Bible of St. John's Lodge No. 1 in New York, upon which George Washington took his inaugural oath as President of the United States. It appears probable that the volume of the sacred law emerged as a distinct and especially venerated symbol sometime in the decade between 1752 and 1762. Before the first date, it certainly was not customary to carry the Bible in Masonic processions, whereas after 1762, a place of honor in such parades was commonly reserved for it. There is a tradition that the Bible was officially declared a great light by the Grand Lodge of England in 1760, but the tail rests on slender support. It is said, for instance, that the motion was proposed by William Preston, but Preston did not become a Mason until 1762. About that time, Thomas Dunkerley was engaged in making a revision of the ritual. One of his recorded addresses contains this passage: "To subdue our passions and improve in useful and scientific knowledge, to instruct the younger brethren, and to initiate the unenlightened, are principal duties in the lodge, which, when done, and the word of God is closed, we indulge with the song and cheerful glass, still observing the same decency and regularity, with strict attention to the golden mean." The words in italics, "the word of God is closed," would seem to indicate that the Bible was at the time open in lodge when Masonic labors were being performed. In an anonymous work called Three Distinct Knocks, published in 1760, the Bible, square, and compass were spoken of as furniture. In Preston's Illustrations, published in 1772, the manner of constituting a new lodge is described. It is significant to observe that among the articles presented to the master at installation are Hiram, master's gavel, the Hiram, which is the master's gavel, the Holy Bible, square and compass, the Book of Constitutions, the Minute Book, the movable jewels, and all the insignia of his different officers. These were presented separately, with an appropriate charge in regard to each. Preston also describes the proper place of the Bible in funeral processions, where it is to be borne along with the Book of Constitutions on a cushion covered with black cloth. In the Master Key, published in 1798 by J. Brown, is a passage under the heading "Why the Bible Makes a Lodge Just." Herein the book is set forth as that sacred history called the Holy Scriptures, handed down by Moses, the inspired writer of God's commands, and who was the Grand Master of the Lodge of Israel. It also contains the writings of the prophets and apostles. By this time, however, Thomas Smith Webb's Monitor had already taken shape, following its publication in 1797, with revisions in 1802 and often thereafter. The significance of the Bible in Masonry stands clearly defined. It had remained for Webb, an American, to digest and present in monitorial form the noblest passages culled from all Masonic ritual. Couched in language always stately and often lofty, Webb's lectures remain the foundation for the standard work, as practiced today in most American lodges. As he had drawn with rare judgment upon the writings of Anderson, French name here, de Saint-Julier, Martin Clare, Thomas Dunkerley, William Hutchinson, William Preston, Lawrence Dermont, and many others, his labors being essentially to the common heritage of English-speaking Masonry. Webb defined the Bible as being both a great light and an indispensable part of lodge furniture. Describing the open book on the altar, he observed that thereby a reverential awe for the deity is inculcated, and the eye fixes on the object from whose radiant beams only light can be derived. Again, he said, every well-governed lodge is furnished with the Holy Bible, the square, and compass. When with memorable ceremonies on December 27, 1813, the two rival Grand Lodges of England effected their union, the Bible had place of high honor. Each Grand Lodge marched into the place of assemblage with its own Bible, borne before its own Grand Master. As a symbol of union, an Ark of the Covenant had been constructed. Upon it was opened the one Bible of the United Grand Lodge, occupying its traditional place with respect of the square and the compass. Summing all the historical evidence, it is therefore clear that so far as there is trustworthy evidence, the Holy Bible has always profoundly influenced Masonic thought, that Freemasonry from time immemorial has obligated its members upon it, or some part of it, that by a process of natural development the Bible became one of fraternity's one of the three most important symbols, greatest of the three, that the presence of an open volume of the sacred law in a lodge room is obligatory, this having come to be commonly regarded as one of the unalterable landmarks of the craft, that for a vast majority of regular Freemasons, that volume is the Holy Bible, and the Holy Bible alone. The Bible, a library. The Holy Bible is not a single book. It is a collection of little books printed together in one volume. These were penned by various authors over a period which may have been as great as 1,600 years or even greater. Some of them bear internal evidence of multiple authorship, as if they had been compiled by editors or boards of editors. They present a wide variety of literary forms, an even greater variety of idioms, differences which often supply the standards by which scholarship measures their respective ages. Languages spoken by living men continually change. The English commonly spoken today is so different from that spoken 500 years ago that few moderns can read a book of the 15th century without the aid of a glossary. The language spoken in England 1,000 years ago was almost as different from that of the England of today as modern English is from modern German. This rule of perpetual transition was true also to greater or less extent of the ancient tongues in which the books of the Bible were originally composed. It is only when a language becomes dead, that is, no longer actively employed by living people in everyday affairs, that it tends to become static and unchangeable. The word Bible itself has attained to its modern meaning through an odd error. At one point of history, men wrote upon sheets of a substance made of the pith of the papyrus reed. Another name for papyrus was biblos. A booklet or roll of this material came to be known to the Greeks as biblion. In the plural, they were called ta biblia, a term which might be translated as the writings. Early Greek Christians fell into a fashion of calling their precious manuscript copies of the Scripture by those words. The expression was taken over into Latin, where the holy writings became known as Biblia Sacra. In time, the Greek plural, biblia, was mistaken for a singular Latin noun of the first declension. Thus, instead of being regarded popularly as a collection of writings or booklets, the Bible was considered merely as one book. In addition to the booklets now assigned to the collection, many others have aspired to places in the sacred library. Some have obtained that distinction and maintained their position for a long time, only to be dropped later as new discoveries made their authenticity doubtful. Some, like the book of Revelation in the New Testament, have been attacked as of doubtful canonicity within comparatively recent times. And for the footnotes, the oldest and most frequent Jewish designation for the whole collection of biblical writings is a word which meant books. Those accepted as authentic and divinely inspired are usually spoken of as coming within the canon of the Holy Scriptures. The word canon is derived from a Greek name for a measuring rod. Great ecclesiastical councils have sometimes been called for the purpose of applying the measurements and pronouncing official judgment. A book which has failed to meet the tests of inspiration as prescribed by ecclesiastical or scholarly authority is rejected as apocryphal, from a word that originally meant hidden but came to mean spurious. Today, there are two canons in Western Christian use. One collection of scriptures considered as canonical by the Roman Catholic Church on the basis of declarations by the Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, contains writings in the Old Testament which are not included in the Bible, accepted as canonical by Protestant churches. These are 1st and 2nd Esdras, Tobit, Judith, Wisdom, Ecclesiasticus, Baruch, Song of the Three Holy Children, History of Susanna, Bel and the Dragon, Prayer of Manasses, 1st Maccabees, 2nd Maccabees, and certain additions to the Book of Esther. The New Testament is identical in the Catholic and Protestant canons. Sometimes the books rejected as apocryphal are printed together as the Apocrypha and bound with the rest of the Bible. The apocryphal book may therefore be defined as a writing which may possess high merit within itself, but which has been declared to lack certain qualifications deemed essential to prove it as a work of divine inspiration. The Bible is separated into two primary divisions. One, known as the Old Testament, contains sacred writings originally in the Hebrew tongue, with the possible exception of Daniel, which appears to have been composed partly in Hebrew, partly in Aramaic. The other, known as the New Testament, contains sacred writings originally in a form of Greek. The Old Testament is a literary record of the social, cultural, ethical, moral, and religious life and aspirations of ancient Israel. The New Testament is a record of how the early development of Christianity is added a word there. It's just a record of Christianity. The Old Testament discloses how belief in the one ever-living and true God, whom in English men name Jehovah, came to dominate the thought and actions of a race supremely endowed with a genius for religion. Which is that race? The Old Testament discloses how belief in the one ever-living and true God came to dominate the thought and actions of a race supremely endowed. So I'm guessing the supreme race here refers to the Jews. The New Testament, accepting the Old as a primary basis of faith, has to do with the mystery of Jesus of Nazareth as incarnate Son of Jehovah, Messiah, Christ, Redeemer of mankind, bringer of a new covenant between Jehovah and his children. Jewish scholars of ancient times grouped their sacred writings under three general heads: the Law, the Prophets, and the Writings, or the Holy Writings, or the Hagiographa. Classified under the first heading were Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Under the second, there were two subclassifications: the former prophets and the latter prophets. Among the former prophets, the Jews included the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Among the latter prophets, they included Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets whose writings were printed together as one book. The writings included all the other books of the Old Testament. The accepted Jewish canon comprises 24 books, 5 in the Pentateuch, 8 in the Prophets, and 11 in the Hagiographa, books of the saints. Arranged thus by classes rather than by seniority, the books soon lost any chronological sequence they may ever have had. There are books in the Old Testament manifestly older than is Genesis, although there can be no doubt that Genesis in its existing form includes some of the oldest traditions and poems of the Israelites. A somewhat similar order of arrangement in the New Testament has caused the Gospels to be printed first. Although many, if not all, of the epistles were written before the oldest of the Gospels in its present form. Of the Gospels themselves, Mark is obviously older than either Matthew or Luke. Although it is printed after the one and before the other, it is possible that Mark was based on a still older manuscript now lost to knowledge. In these centuries of time intervening between the Testaments, The Hebrews of the Old Testament had ceased to be the everyday. So the Hebrew language of the Old Testament had ceased to be the everyday language of a people, but had become a dead language, jealousy preserved in the ancient writings. New local languages and dialects had sprang up, and out of these had developed a blend of various ancient and modern tongues, which was used throughout Palestine. It is usually called Aramaic, and was the language spoken by Jesus and his disciples. For literary purposes, Greek had come into general use. It is of importance to bear these facts in mind, for they help to clear up the mystery of how the Bible came into its modern mold, and how some books were readily accepted as canonical, and others were rejected as spurious. It will be helpful to remember also that the early Christians regarded the Old Testament as their Bible. Their own writings did not take biblical form until later years. This was because at first most of them believed the second coming of Christ was at hand, and it was therefore unnecessary to expend literary energy preparing a complete record of the Savior's earthly ministry. Epistles and Gospels were written from time to time to serve the needs of the young churches. They were copied, passed from hand to hand, and thus preserved. When afterwards the time came for compiling a complete library of the books of the Old and New Testaments, the chief problem was one of selection. There were Hebrew writings, Aramaic writings, Greek writings, and Latin writings. By a gradual process of comparison and correction, the New Testament canon virtually shaped itself. Matters were more complicated in regard to the Old Testament because there were two conflicting sources of Jewish scholarship and Jewish thought. One held strictly to the belief that only the ancient books in Hebrew should be regarded as Holy Scripture, would accept none as authentic for which a Hebrew original could not be found, or at least reasonably implied. The other school was less intolerant of books in Aramaic and Greek. The Old Testament books, now regarded as apocryphal by Protestant authorities, were rejected by the strictest of the Jewish schools, mainly because they could not pass the most rigid of these tests. All close students of the Book of Books are familiar with what appear to be the discrepancies between different accounts of the same event. These appear inconsistencies, however, are to a discerning mind the best evidence of the essential truth of a particular narrative. They merely mean that different persons have given, as best he could, their separate accounts of what they have seen or heard or learned or understood. A great deal of early Israelitish tradition must have been handed down by word of mouth for generation after generation. The Israelites were wanderers. They came into contact with all kinds of people and societies and naturally were influenced thereby. When, in comparatively modern times, a historian set himself to the task of recapitulating the story of Jehovah's dealings with his chosen people, there was a vast store of traditional material upon which he could draw. Sometimes, when he had two separate versions, he would use the one which his personal sense of inspiration led him to accept. Sometimes, however, rather than risk a possible mistake, he would incorporate both. Critical examination of the textual structure of Genesis discloses the practical working out of such a process. Sometimes also, manuscripts were copied by scribes who saw fit to interpolate their own observations by way of marginal note or comment, and these additions would be perpetuated in the text by later copyists. Such interpolations are often detected, however, by comparisons with other manuscripts of great antiquity in which the interlineations do not appear. Nobody can read the scriptures sympathetically without observing how many different kinds of persons have been made the vehicles through whom God has revealed himself. Among them were poets, philosophers, lawyers, historians, soldiers, monarchs, slaves, farmers, shepherds, fishermen, mystics, skeptics, good persons and bad persons of both sexes, and all ages and conditions. Each recorded in his own way and to the best of his skill whatever glimpse of the divine will and purpose was vouchsafed to him. The language of one would be matter-of-fact, dry, and didactic. That of another would be emotional and imaginative. One would be stirred to bitter vituperation of the sins of his day. Another would soar aloft on pinions of joy and hope. It is but cold and negative to describe the riches of this glorious literature by saying that its collective writings give a marvelous account of the growth of human insight into monotheistic religion. They do that, of course, but they do far more than that. They vitalize human faith, ennoble human thought, inspire men to right conduct, exalt the mind, and rejoice the heart. Regarded either as literature or as revealed religion, the Book of Books remains for all men of good will, of whatever creed, sect, or opinion, a lamp unto their feet and a light unto their pathway. The story of the English Bible. The Holy Bible is more than a sacred book to English-speaking peoples. It is part and parcel of their law, of their customs, of their nomenclature, of their language. Its phrases are so intertwined with the daily thought and expression of the people that it is almost impossible to hold any prolonged discussion without borrowing consciously or unconsciously from its colorful phraseology. Its history is part of the history of the rise of democratic government. Its teachings have furnished shibboleths for every popular cause. How this came about is an interesting tale. In the first years of the Christian era, as has been shown, the scriptures consisted of separate and often detached manuscripts. A church or other religious society might have one or more of these, accounting itself rich in proportion to the number. They were laboriously copied by scribes, deriving added value from the difficulty and expense incidental to such a process. The growing power of the Church at Rome, together with its influence throughout the vast lands tributary to Roman civil law, or Roman civil power, naturally resulted in the translation of great numbers of them into Latin. These transcriptions gave rise in the first centuries to numerous and bitter debates, not only as to the purity of the several texts, but also to the canonicity of scriptures held forth as divinely inspired. The most notable of the Latin versions took shape under the hands of a scholarly monk, Eusebius Hieronymus, now commonly known as Saint Jerome. In the year 385, Jerome presented a complete revision of the New Testament from manuscripts then available. To this he added a new translation of the Old Testament, direct from the original Hebrew, being aided in the work by some of the foremost Jewish scholars of the day. The whole was done into the Latin vernacular, whence it became known as the Vulgate. It was the foundation of the Bible used today in Roman Catholic worship. However useful a Latin Bible might be to those skilled in that tongue, it was a closed book to the great masses of the people in faraway Britain, save as it might be expounded by priests and missionaries. At an early period, however, paraphrases of biblical narratives were turned into rude Anglo-Saxon verses, which everywhere were heard and repeated with delight. There is a tradition that these poetic versions were composed by the poet Caedmon, and a beautiful legend is told of how he received celestial command to sing the inspired tale to his fellows. From time to time, other transcriptions and translations appeared piecemeal in the various dialects then spoken in England, some ascribed to one person, some to another. Toward the middle of the 8th century, the monk Beda, the Venerable Bede, father of English history, is said to have crowned his life work in a translation into the common language of the Gospel of John. Legend says that Bida, although dying a lingering death from disease, was miraculously spared until he finished the task. King Alfred the Great is also credited, although the historical warrant therefore appears to be but slight, with having translated the Ten Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, and the Psalms into the popular idiom. After the Norman conquest, such translations of the scriptures as appeared in England were in French. It was not until the 14th century that a really important English edition appeared, although numerous translations of parts of the Bible were scattered throughout the land. By that time, however, the religious unrest which was to swell into the Protestant Reformation had begun to make itself felt in England. One of the leaders in this discontent was a parish priest, John Wycliffe, whose views were so advanced for the time that he had already begun to argue that the Bible, and not the Church, was man's supreme spiritual authority. It was not surprising, therefore, that he should undertake the preparation of a Bible for general reading, or that these activities should bring him under the suspicion of his ecclesiastical superiors. How much Wycliffe had personally to do with the version which has since borne his name is not easy to determine. It is said that Nicholas de Hereford of Oxford translated about half of the Old Testament, and that John Purvey, an associate, completed a revision of the whole. Doubtless, several individuals took part in the work. The book itself was a translation of the Vulgate by St. Jerome. It became exceedingly popular and held its place in English esteem through the long persecution which swiftly set in against the Lollards, as religionists of the Wycliffe school were known. At the end of another 100 years, however, the way was being cleared for a new and better version. The New Learning, as it was called, had revived the interests of the Western world in Greek and Hebrew, and grammars of both had appeared. Printing had been invented, making it no longer necessary to copy manuscripts by hand. Erasmus had issued a New Testament in Greek. This and an Old Testament in Hebrew greatly stirred the interest of William Tyndale, a scholar of Oxford and Cambridge. Tyndale determined to undertake a translation in which not the Vulgate, but the original Greek and Hebrew should be the basis of his study. His proposal was so frowned upon by the episcopate of England that he left his own country in exile to pursue his labors abroad, first in Hamburg, then in Wittenberg, then in Cologne, then in Worms, and finally in Antwerp. In spite of difficulties and persecutions, he kept faithfully to his task. When his New Testament was printed, he was obliged to smuggle copies of it into England. The authorities seized and destroyed every one upon which they could lay their hands. Ultimately, the influence of the English bishops was strong enough to procure his arrest. He was thrown into a prison near Brussels, tried for heresy, condemned to death. On October 6, 1563, he was strangled, and his body was burned at the stake. Tyndale at that time had succeeded in translating only the New Testament, the Pentateuch, the historical books, and part of the prophets, but the vigor of his English, the grace and charm of his style were destined to have a permanent effect upon the English Bible and upon English prose. Moreover, the English public was eager for the Bible in an idiom that they could readily grasp and easily understand. Following is Tyndale's translation of the Lord's Prayer, which may be cited as an excellent sample of his method. O our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Let thy kingdom come, thy will be fulfilled, as well in earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, even as we forgive them which trespass us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. After Tyndale's death, the resentment with which the public regarded his persecution bore quick fruit. He had lost a battle, and with it his life, but he had won the war. Miles Coverdale, an Augustinian friar, had been working separately on a translation which was able to publish it in 1535, a short time before Tyndale's death. In 1537, still another translation was brought out as the work of Thomas Matthew, a name believed to be an alias for John Rogers, a friend of Tyndale. All of these books found such ready circulation that the bishops took cognizance thereof and began to press for the completion of a new work of their own. This work, known as the Great Bible, was published in 1539, proved in effect to be a compound revision of the Tyndale, Coverdale, and Rogers translations. Within 3 months of the accession of Queen Elizabeth to the English throne, after the death of Queen Mary in 1558, still another edition appeared. This is known as the Genevan Bible because it was produced in Geneva by English exiles from the persecutions under Mary. It has been less reverently referred to as the Breeches Bible because the translators said that Adam and Eve sewed fig leaves together and made themselves breeches. It was the first to adopt the present system of division by verses, and the first to separate the Apocrypha from the other books of the Old Testament and label them as apocryphal. In retaliation for the Genevan Bible, members of the Romanist party in England produced a new translation of the Vulgate, which became known as the Reims and Douai version. All these successive works may be regarded as having but paved the way for the King James Version, greatest and noblest of them all. Soon after James I came to the throne, he summoned the ablest scholars of England, without regard to party, creed, or sect, and entrusted to them the task of making a uniform translation of the Scriptures. They divided themselves into 6 groups, each with a definite assignment of work. They consulted all the best authorities at home and abroad, and zealously compared all known translations in all languages of Europe. After about 7 years of labor, they completed the Authorized Version, which has remained from that day to this the Bible of Bibles for all English-speaking peoples. Although changing fashions in spelling and altered meanings of words have necessitated numerous textual revisions, it stands today, as it was then, the proudest achievement of English scholarship. Its language is stately and sonorous and dignified. It fixed the standards of English prose, by which all subsequent developments of that colorful and flexible medium are measured. Its fame as literature has rivaled its fame as a religious masterpiece. Wherever the English language is spoken or written, there is not a person who does not owe to it a debt of gratitude. The more skillful in the use of English a man becomes, the greater is his debt. The legend of the craft. No man can say with any degree of certainty how old Freemasonry is. Innumerable efforts have been made to trace its origin or origins, but all have invariably gone back to a misty era of legend and tradition. Through this labyrinth, romantic speculation has traced many pathways, winding and devious, some of them going back to the most primitive stages of human society. All of these efforts, modern scientific criticism can only say, of all these efforts, we can only say, beyond a certain point, they begin in guesswork and end in dreams. All that can be said with assurance is that the institution is old in point of verifiable history, that it may be far older than can be proved, that certainly it is heir to the cult system of many ages. When Freemasonry first appears in tangible, definite form, it belongs among the medieval trade guilds of England. It is one of the many craft associations, differing, however, in many respects from all other guilds. The earliest known societies of guild or operative masons possessed old manuscripts upon which they set great store. These are variously known as the Old Charges, the Ancient Constitutions, the Ancient Manuscripts, and the Gothic manuscripts. All of them gave one or more of several variations of what has come to be known as the legend of the craft. The oldest thus far known is the Regius Poem, of which mention has heretofore been made. It was discovered in the King's Library of the British Museum and was published in 1840 by James O. Halliwell, who was not a member of the fraternity. Apparently, it was written in about the year 1390. Another of great antiquity, known as the Dowland manuscript, gives the legend of the craft, in which may be regarded as typical narrative form. According to this account, Freemasonry existed before the flood. That means the biblical flood with Noah and his ark, and he lands somewhere north of the Fertile Crescent in the mountains of Turkey or the Caucasus. Let's continue. It is related that the Israelitish patriarch Lamech had two wives, Ada and Zillah. By Zillah he had two sons, Jabal, father of tent dwellers and herdsmen, and Jubal, father of music. By Ada he had another son, Tubal-Cain, founder of smithcraft in gold, silver, copper, iron, and steel, and a daughter who was the founder of weaving. Having premonition of the impending deluge and being custodians of the art of masonry, the three brothers determined to write their discoveries on two pillars, one of marble, which would resist fire, and one of brick, which would resist flood. Auxiliary traditions assert that one of these pillars was found in later years by Hermes Trismegistus, Egyptian priest and scholar, and the other by Pythagoras, the great philosopher. The legend goes on to relate how Freemasonry flourished after the flood, the mythical hero Nimrod being represented as among its foremost devotees. Masons are said to have built the Tower of Babel, which, if you've read the Bible, you know the Tower of Babel is regarded as a sin against God, and he destroys it and strikes it down. So I'd like to hear the Masonic explanation for that one. Abraham is said to have taught the secrets of Freemasonry to the Egyptians in Abraham's time by one of those anachronisms characteristic of folklore. The mathematician Euclid is said to have been the foremost teacher of geometry, which now is called throughout all this land Masonry. Coming down to the time of King Solomon, the legend tells of the building of the famous temple at Jerusalem, described as a strictly Masonic enterprise. The work was said to have been under the direction of King Solomon, of Hiram, king of Tyre, and of Ainon, described as a son of Hiram of Tyre. This name is undoubtedly a variant of that of Hiram Abif of the later legend of the temple, although that master workman in the biblical account was not a son of King Hiram, but of a Tyrian workman. When the temple was completed, the story runs, its Masonic artisans scattered abroad, carrying masonry into all parts of the world. One of them, a certain Namus Grecus, took it into France, whence it was taken to England in St. Albans' time. There it died out until it was restored in the time of King Athelstan, when Prince Edwin convoked a great Masonic assembly at York. From that assemblage, all subsequent English Masonry was said to have derived in an unbroken line. Through all their variations, the old manuscripts tell pretty much the same tale. However far they may stray from a direct course, the building of Solomon's Temple becomes a focal point upon which all the accounts converge. It is easy to see, therefore, that long before the legend of the temple took the poetic and dramatic form it has since assumed, the temple itself occupied a central place in the legend of the craft. That these ancient tales are to be regarded as literal truth, no serious scholar nowadays ventures to assume. In an uncritical age, they were accepted as correct. Even today, there are Freemasons who accept as authentic the story that Freemasonry assumed its position as a secret society under King Solomon. Whether that is true or untrue, there is no corroboration of the legend, which a modern historian can accept as evidence. This does not affect Masonry's claim to great antiquity, which can be established on other and far surer ground. Neither does it detract in the slightest degree from the value of the allegory of the temple and its builders as the legend appears in Masonic ritual. So I'd like to hear what that surer ground is. I don't think it's going to be provided here. The legend of the temple. The Masonic story of the building of King Solomon's temple contains elements not found in scriptural accounts of the same enterprise. Indeed, Masonry has considerably shifted the emphasis which writers of the sacred books placed upon that undertaking. To them, the temple itself was the central theme in the story. Masonic interest centers rather upon individuals, and most of all upon a single individual who is relegated to a comparatively minor role in the biblical story. Biblical writers themselves give his name in various forms. The modern drama of the third degree is the supreme flowering of Masonic ritual. The adjective modern is used advisedly, for there is every reason to suppose that the drama itself has taken definitive shape within less than the last 300 years. That its germs lay dormant for much longer is susceptible of demonstration, but is equally certain that far maturer and more sophisticated minds than those possessed by the operative Masons were responsible for the beauty and perfection of detail, perfection of detail the epic of Hiram the Builder has come to assume. There is no sound reason to believe the drama of Hiram began taking its present form until after the establishment of the Grand Lodge of England in the first quarter of the 18th century. The old manuscripts treat the master builder almost as negligently as he is treated in Holy Writ. It is not, in fact, until the Dowland manuscript of the year 1500 that his Masonic identity stands clearly revealed. Even that document contains evidence of confusion about him, since his name was given as Einon, and he is erroneously described as a son of the king of Tyre. Other ancient traditions give him other names. Even biblical commentators of early days rarely stopped to consider the important fact that this individual was specifically mentioned in Old Testament accounts, wherein, as the custom was, kings and rulers were credited with the achievements of their gifted subordinates. Masonic interest in Solomon's Temple became particularly acute in the last half of the 17th century and the first part of the 18th, for the very good reason that all scholarly interest in England centered upon the same subject at the same time. The King James Bible had become widely used, and a recent translation of Josephus had attained to popularity. Learned men indulged in speculation about King Solomon's Temple. Books were written about it. Models of it were constructed and placed on exhibition. It was but natural that English Masons could be especially stirred, since from of old the temple had held an important place in their traditions. When James Anderson in 1723 revised the legend of the craft for his constitutions, he He had given thought to the place of Hiram Abiff in the story, but he nevertheless described him only as a head workman. But for his second edition, published in 1738, Anderson saw fit to make a significant alteration. In this, Hiram Abiff appeared not as head workman, but as Grand Master. This can be accounted for only on the hypothesis that ritualistic changes involving the personality of the builder had been made in the 15 years intervening between the two editions. From the evidence available, it is not particularly difficult to guess what had taken place. In the days of operative masonry prior to 1717, it is probable that Masons used only one, at most two, ceremonies of initiation. These rites must have been relatively simple. After the founding of the speculative system, it is reasonably certain that these rites were not only expanded, but that new lectures and discussions were required to explain their meanings. Ultimately, it became necessary to revise the whole into a system of greater content and closer interrelation. It is by no means improbable that, under the direction of Anderson and de Sagulier, read that however you pronounce that in French, Desagulliers, de Sagulier, the present system of 3 degrees swiftly took shape, the legend of the temple being enlarged until it held a far more prominent place than it had occupied before. However that may be, the undeniable fact remains that, out of all its magnificent store of tradition and lore, Freemasonry has chosen the story of Solomon's Temple and its builders to be the foundation stone of its complex system of allegory, symbol, and ritual. Nor have later degree makers, builders of concordant systems, piling degree upon degree, rank upon rank, station upon station, succeeded in getting far from the basic legend, no matter in what direction their fancies have wandered. Matter-of-fact persons may not find it easy to account for the variations between the Masonic story and the accounts of the Old Testament. The explanation is simple enough, however, to those who understand the basic truth that in Freemasonry more is often meant than meets either ear or eye. Masonic thought has far less concern with the historical Solomon than it has with Solomon as a symbol of a wise ruler, with the historical master workman than with Hiram Abiff, symbol of a true craftsman, faithful to his trust unto death, with the material edifice erected on Mount Moriah, than with the spiritual building, that house not made with hands, which each must raise for himself, its foundations going down to the bedrock of faith, its pinnacles reaching upward to God. King Solomon's Temple. The building of King Solomon's Temple was a tremendous factor in Israelitish history, which might fairly be divided into 2 great epochs of before the temple and after the temple. Holy Writ twice tells the story in detail, and otherwise alludes to it on numerous other occasions. Its erection became the sign and seal of nationality, as well as of a triumphant religion. There is open question as to whether its political importance did not even outweigh its religious significance. It is a theme which fills 5 chapters of 1 Kings and 6 of 2 Chronicles. It occupies an important place in the book of Ezekiel. As its erection cemented the tribes of Israel into a nation, so did its destruction mark the nadir of their national hope. Its poets and historians may have exaggerated its value as a work of architecture, but it was impossible for Israelites to exaggerate its value as a work of political and religious ceremony. In their beginnings, the Israelites comprised a group of migrant tribes not unlike the Bedouins of later times. After a long period of wanderings and vivisectitudes, vicissitudes. Vicissitudes, I guess is the word. Vicissitudes, they found their land of promise in the settled regions west of the river Jordan, then known as Canaan. The central geographical feature of this region was a high plateau crisscrossed with deep valleys. The hills afforded admirable means of defense, the valleys flood and passage for man and beast. The valleys food and passage. A land small in extent, yet so fortified by nature as to be easily maintained by a strong and resolute militia. Here the newcomers spent almost 2 centuries in continuous warfare to subdue the prior settlers they had found in possession. Occasionally, the tribes varied the monotony by fighting one another. Nevertheless, the common necessity of presenting a unified front against common enemies, together with the cohesive force of their monotheistic religion, forced them to a more compact form of government than their earlier tribal organizations would allow. Finally, a chieftain of the tribe of Benjamin was able to effect a union of tribes and was proclaimed king. He was a warrior and a doer, but unskilled in the arts of rulership. He was unable to establish his dynasty. A far abler man was soon to rise, David, the warrior, poet, king. After the death of Saul, David occupied the throne and became the first monarch of an Israel united in fact, although he was second king in name. David, with a good eye for military advantages, captured a hill fortress known as Jebus. This had been a holy place and a stronghold of native tribes long before the Israelites came. It was really a plateau with a deep central valley and 2 important peaks. The one at the west rising to about 2,500 feet above sea level, the other toward the east being about 100 feet lower. David decided this was an ideal spot for a national capital and established there a city which in time came to be known as Jerusalem. The more eastern of the 2 hills came to be known as Mount Moriah, traditional site of the spot whereupon Abraham proposed to offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice. Afterward, the site of Solomon's temple, and at present occupied by the Mosque of Omar. Hebrew tradition also identifies the spot with the site of the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite, upon which an angel of the Lord stood and stretched forth his hand to destroy Jerusalem before the Lord intervened to spare that catastrophe. Among other designs attributed to David was one for constructing at the national seat a temple to Jehovah, which would be the center of national worship. He did, in fact, begin to collect a mass of material and actually entered into negotiations for assistance from neighboring monarchs, but for reasons variously given in the scriptures, abandoned the project. David ruled Israel wisely and well, maintaining order and harmonizing with truly royal skill the still discordant factions of his kingdom. Upon his death, family intrigue prevented the succession of his eldest son, who was passed over in favor of Solomon, a younger son of David, by the beautiful and talented Bathsheba. Solomon at once proved that a man of different and harder temper had grasped the reins of power. For the relatively placatory policies of his father, he substituted the harsh regime of an oriental despot. One after another, he slaughtered all the important personages whom he suspected of want of sympathy with his personal ambitions. The pleading of his royal mother could not avail to spare the life of one against whom the king was resentful. The altar of Jehovah was no longer inviolate when an enemy of the king sought asylum there. In his foreign policy, he chose the easy road of alliance, sealing his compacts with marriages which turned his household into a harem. Princesses of Egypt, Ammon, Moab, Edom, Sidon, the lands of the Hittites and of the Canaanites, purchased with their beauty the immunity from Israelitish wrath, which a Joshua or Caleb had taught to give edge to the sword. Yet Solomon had amiable characteristics which were turned to the glory of his people. He was particularly gifted with a skill in repartee, which lent to his sayings the authority of maxims. He was a shrewd judge of the innate traits of men and women. He was curious as to the secret knowledge which constituted the power of priests, wizards, and magicians held over the common people. If he could be implacable toward his foes, he could be singularly winsome to those whom interest or inclination impelled him to choose for friends. He cultivated the language of polite society without alienating himself wholly from the stern precepts of Zion. He succeeded in impressing upon the rude peoples around him so firm a stamp of his personal genius that it persisted throughout all succeeding ages and is still acknowledged by the followers of Judaism, Christianity, and Mohammedanism. How do they say this? Mohammedism. That Freemasons of a later time should without debate accept him as their patron is but another testimonial of the universal esteem in which his memory has been held. Solomon found Jerusalem a rough village in the Judean hills. He determined to make it a place of splendor, rivaling more ambitious capitals to the east and west. To this he lavished all the resources at his command, pursued the arts of trade and commerce to an extent undreamed of by his sires, placed heavy burdens of taxation upon his people, reduced common workmen to a state of virtual slavery, attracted foreigners of distinction to his court, introduced strange customs, and gave countenance to alien rites, engaged in constant intercourse with the merchants, artisans, and princes of neighboring nations. Solomon's crowning work, however, was the erection of a group of 3 royal buildings and a temple to Jehovah. In modern times, there has been a tendency to suppose that the temple was originally designed merely as a royal chapel, and that its subsequent importance was attained beyond the expectations of the royal builder. It is unnecessary now to inquire into that. Regardless of what may have been in the king's mind at the outset, the historical fact is that the temple came to have a significance immeasurably important beyond the importance of Solomon himself. It became the center and chief seat of the worship of Jehovah, overshadowing all lesser shrines, the religious and ethical capital of the Jewish religion as well as of the Jewish race. Construction of the temple. Through all succeeding ages, the construction of King Solomon's temple has piqued the curiosity of men. Innumerable attempts have been made to analyze the accounts of kings and chronicles and the measurements given by Ezekiel. These last have occasioned much dispute because there is uncertainty as to the exact meaning of the word cubit in Hebrew idiom. Apparently it varied from generation to generation, so that a cubit of one era would differ from a cubit of another. In modern times, the utmost extravagances have crept into the reconstructions. Obscure passages have been interpreted as pointing to the erection of majestic towers and vast piles of masonry. Sometimes the cubit is represented as meaning 21 inches, sometimes as being greater, and sometimes as less. For purposes of the present discussion, a medium standard is chosen. Evidence as to the existence of high towers is so dubious that it will be disregarded. This means that the extreme outside length of the temple could not have been more than 170 feet, that its maximum breadth outside was not in excess of 70 feet, its greatest height at the porch was not more than 50 feet. Minimum estimates place the length at 104 feet, the breadth at a little more than a third of that, the height at exactly a third of the length. A passage in Chronicles giving the height of the porch as 120 cubits is regarded by biblical critics as resting upon a corruption of the original Palestine of its day. Would scarcely be regarded as such in a modern city. The group of buildings erected by Solomon was situated on the hill called Mount Moriah. The first, as one approached from below, was called the Forest of Lebanon because it contained 45 great pillars made of cedars from Lebanon. Apparently, it was used to house the king's bodyguard. A little to the north of this was the second building known as the Hall of Pillars, about 80 feet long by 80 feet wide, probably used as a court or judgment hall. Between this building and the temple proper was a third structure, a royal palace, used as the residence of the king and his Egyptian queen. All three buildings and their adjacent courts were enclosed by a wall of hewn stone, surmounted by a course of cedar beams. The temple itself is divided into three parts: the most holy place, and the porch or vestibule. It lay east and west in each of its parts. It was 1 story high with a flat roof, which may or may not have had support from interior pillars. If measures given by Ezekiel are to be trusted, the outside walls were of hewn stone, 10 feet thick at the base, tapering at the top, growing 1 foot thinner, with each of the outer stones small rooms built into the thick wall. These tiny apartments in the walls were used by the priests for the storage of vestments and other paraphernalia. The important room of the temple was at the rear. It was the Holy of Holies, or oracle, regarded as the awful abiding place of Jehovah. It was an exact cube, which is interesting because if you go to Mecca right now, there's a big black cube, and that would seem to be very, very similar to the idea that Jehovah is located inside this cube. The concept of a cube being very important here in Semitic religion. Approximately 35 feet in all interior dimensions, windowless, and with but one door which opened into the secondary chamber or holy place. In this oracle was placed the Ark of the Covenant, symbol of the presence of Jehovah. The Ark, and guarding it stood the cherubim, colossal figures, each with the body of an ox, the face of a man, and the wings of an angel. Their height was 17 feet. Their outstretched wings measured 9 feet. A folding door of solid olive wood and consisting of 2 leaves opened from the oracle into the holy place, a kind of audience chamber 35 feet wide, upwards of 100 feet in length and 50 feet in height. This was lighted by clerestory windows, narrow apertures just below the roof. The walls were wainscoted with cedar. Hebrew tradition says that they and the roof were also covered with gold. Directly in front of the door leading out of the Holy of Holies was an altar on which the sacramental bread was placed. The audience chamber opened in turn, and by folding doors similar to the others, into a porch or vestibule 35 feet wide, 15 feet deep. Somewhere upon this porch were 2 hollow bronze pillars about 6 feet in diameter and 30 feet in height. Their chapiters were adorned with pomegranates and lilies. The temple was enclosed by a paved courtyard and a wall made of layers of stone and cedar beams. Descending from the porch by a series of steps, the worshipper came upon a flat rock, upon which was placed the altar of burnt sacrifice and the brazen sea. This was an enormous basin, about 9 feet high and 50 feet in diameter, holding some 16,000 gallons of water. It was constructed under the direction of Hiram, king of Tyre, perhaps under the immediate oversight of Hiram the builder, and was of striking proportions, resting as it did upon 12 bronze oxen. To make it easy to carry water about, the priests were supplied with 10 smaller basins on movable stands. The temple was about 7 years in building. As many as 40,000 or 50,000 men may have been employed on the site. Its stone was taken from nearby quarries, some of them on the site itself. Its timbers were brought at the cost of great labor from faraway Lebanon. Solomon also undoubtedly lavished enormous treasure upon the ornamentation of his temple, although Oriental hyperbole appears to make the total cost fantastic beyond credence. Gold, silver, bronze, iron, semi-precious stones, carved wood, and fine cloth fabrics were employed to enhance its splendor and spread abroad the fame of its riches. It is, however, almost impossible from the various sums mentioned in the scripture to get a fair approximation of the actual expense. They were expressed in terms of the talent, which was a measure of weight as well as of price. One standard of values would make the cost of gold and silver alone somewhere in the neighborhood of $5.5 billion of American dollars. Remember, this is 1923 when, or 1928 this was published, prior to the crash of 1929, which produced an enormous amount of inflation. So a billionaire today is something within the realm of possibility. A billionaire in 1928 was not possible. At most, you would have a millionaire. So we're talking about taking 1,000 of the richest men all across the earth and combining that into one temple. And that's what they're trying to communicate here. Okay, so at that rate, the total would have been somewhere in the neighborhood of $7 billion, a sum which would have taxed the resources of a nation as great as Rome was in the heyday of its prosperity. Indeed, it would represent almost twice the appropriations for all purposes of the United States government in the year 1927, or more than 4 times of its 1928 appropriations, exclusive of those for the reduction of the public debt. It is impossible to believe that Israel and all its Palestinian neighbors could have contributed so much to a cause in the time of Solomon. Taking even a more moderate estimate of the value of the gold talent, it is still difficult to believe that the sums mentioned in 1 Chronicles are not the result of an error by some copyist or translator. Here David is quoted as bequeathing to his heir for the temple 100,000 talents in gold and 1,000,000 talents in silver. The Hebraic, Assyrian, and Babylonian talent varied in value between $15,000 and $2,000. This would make David's gold alone worth from $155 million to $200 million. But the income of Solomon at the period of his greatest influence was put at about 666 talents of gold in a single year. Interesting number. At that rate, it would have taken Solomon's predecessors more than 158 years to accumulate 100,000 gold talents if they had not spent a cent of principal. The condition of Israel in those early days forbids the probability of any such accumulation. Moreover, there are indications that Solomon spent a great part of his riches upon other buildings, notably the Forest of Lebanon. This structure was 13 years in building, as against 7 for the temple. 2 Chronicles suggests that a very large proportion of the gold that came to him went into his place and its appointments. Nevertheless, and after all discounts are made for the enthusiasm of the ancient scribes, the errors of copyists and translators, the extravagancies of modern theorists who have built upon these materials, it is clear that enough treasure was squandered upon the temple to excite the wonder of all neighboring lands and to provide a basis for a satisfactory understanding of the exaggerations which crept into the accounts of later historians concerning the identity of its architect. The scriptures are vague. Masonic tradition ascribes this role to Hiram Abif. The biblical account intimates rather that this man was a metallurgist and a decorator charged with beautifying the temple and arranging its accessories. It is well known that the Phoenicians of that day were particularly apt in the working of metals and in the carving of ornamentations. Certain passages in the Bible may be liberally construed as meaning that the master workman had a special charge over the casting of the enormous bronze of the great pillars, the brazen sea, and the lavers. But a letter from the king of Tyre to Solomon relates that he was equally skillful at all other kinds of work, and his part in the undertaking may have been far greater than the Israelitish historians were willing to acknowledge of one who was but a half-caste in their own household of faith. Interesting that they refer to the king of Tyre as a half-caste, or a racial mongrel compared to their own caste. This is like a very racist book, by the way, just so you know that. Whatever may have been Solomon's purpose in erecting the temple, it rapidly became the pride and boast of all Israel. Historically, it is not far wrong to say that it confirmed the place of Jerusalem as permanent capital of the nation, that it helped to secure the Davidic dynasty, that it became in the minds of neighboring tribes, and many of whom still cherish secret allegiance to pagan deities, the seat and home of the one great God Jehovah. It quickly became the headquarters of a regnant priesthood, destined steadily to grow in power and influence. Pilgrims who previously had gone to the holy shrines of Bethel and Gilgal now directed their footsteps toward Jerusalem. The wonder of this new building spread to faraway wanderers on the fringes of the desert, filling them with the most exalted ideas of the splendor and magnificence of the Israelitish monarch. Long after it was destroyed by the ruthless hands of barbaric forces, its renown was to fire the imaginations of men. The tabernacle model of the temple. King Solomon's temple was a gigantic reproduction in wood and stone of the tabernacle, or movable shrine, which ancient Israel carried on the march after the departure from Egypt. Elaborate descriptions of this place of worship are contained in the book of Exodus. Whenever the tribes stopped to make camp, they arranged themselves in the form of a hollow square with the tabernacle in the center. Putting up and taking down the walls and coverings of the shrine was a work of particular care, that there might be no profanation of the holy articles it contained. The tabernacle itself was a kind of tent made of two sets of curtains, arranged on a framework of light woods. It was situated east and west within a rectangular court. The interior was divided into two counterparts, separated from each other by a curtain. One was known as the holy place, and the other as the most holy place. The most holy place was a perfect cube. Again, that cube symbolism. Not a Star of David, not a six-pointed star, but a cube is the important object here. It was situated, blah, blah, blah. The perfect cube, regarded as the true dwelling place of Jehovah, contained the Ark of the Covenant, surmounted by cherubim guarding the mercy seat. Holy place was 20 cubits by 10 broad. Its chief article of furniture was a table on which the sanctified bread was displayed. The table was of acacia wood and covered with gold. Upon it were gold dishes, spoons, cups, decanters, and bowls, symbols of a sacrificial feast. The interior was illuminated by a gold candlestick with a main stem and 3 pairs of arms curving upward. Tongs and dishes and vessels to contain oil, all made of gold, were accessories to the candlestick. The passage in Exodus mentions also an altar of incense placed just east of the veil before the Holy of Holies. The Ark of the Covenant, the holiest, most venerated of all sacred possessions of the Israelites, was the Ark of the Covenant. It was a chest of acacia wood, 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 deep, 1.5 wide. Covering its lid was a plate of gold known as the mercy seat. At its ends were 2 cherubim facing each other, symbols of the presence of Jehovah. Within the chest, 2 tablets of stone containing the text of Jehovah's covenant with Israel. Gold rings at the corner of the box allowed it to be carried. It was transported whenever Israel was on the march, a constant reminder to the peoples of the stress that Jehovah was with them. Its fate after the destruction of King Solomon's temple is obscure, but there is reason to believe it may be carried off by a barbarian warrior. The Bible and Masonic ritual. Biblical allusions in Masonic ritual are innumerable. Some of these better known, however, are as follows. Entered apprentice degree. Behold how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. It is like the precious anointment upon the head that ran down the beard, even Aaron's beard, that went down to the skirts of his garments, as the dew of Hermon, as the dew that descended upon the mountains of Zion. For there the Lord commanded the blessing, even life forevermore. Fellow craft degree. Thus he showed me, and behold, the Lord stood upon a wall made by a plumb line, and with a plumb line in his hand. And the Lord said unto me, Amos, what seest thou? And I said, A plumb line. And said the Lord, Behold, I will set a plumb line in the midst of my people Israel. I will not again pass by them any more. Master Mason degree. Remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, while the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them, while the sun, or the light, or the moon, or the stars be not darkened, nor the clouds return after the rain. In the day when the keepers of the house shall tremble, and the strong men shall bow themselves, and the grinders cease because they are few, and those that look out of the windows be darkened, and the doors shall be shut in the streets, and the sound of the grinding is low. And he shall rise up at the voice of the bird, and all the daughters of music shall be brought low. And when they shall be afraid of that which is high, and fears shall be in the way, and the almond tree shall flourish, and the grasshopper shall be a burden, and desire shall fall, because man goeth to his long home, and the mourners go about the streets, or ever the silver cord be loosed, or the golden bow be broken, or the pitcher be broken at the fountain, or the wheel be broken at the cistern. Then shall the dust return to the earth as it was, and the spirit shall return unto God who gave it. Eler's funeral service. The hand of the Lord was upon me, and carried me out into the spirit of the Lord, who set me down in the midst of the valley which was full of bones, and caused me to pass by them round about. And behold, there were very many in the open valley, and lo, they were very dry. And he said unto me, Son of man, can these bones live? And I answered, O Lord God, thou knowest. Again he said to me, Prophesy upon these bones, and say unto them, O ye dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord God unto these bones, Behold, I will cause breath to enter into you, and ye shall live. And I will lay sinews upon you, and will bring up flesh upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you, and ye shall live. And ye shall know I am the Lord. So I prophesied as I was commanded, and as I prophesied there was a noise, and behold, a shaking, and the bones came together, bone to bone. And when I beheld, lo, the sinews and the flesh came up upon them, and the skin was covered them above, but there was no breath in them. Then said he unto me, Prophesy unto the wind, prophesy, Son of man, and say to the wind, Thus saith the Lord God, Come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe upon these slain, that they may live. So I prophesied as he commanded me, and the breath came into them, and they lived and stood up upon their feet, an exceedingly great army. The revolt of Ephraim. And the men of Ephraim gathered themselves together, and went northward, and said unto Jephthah, Wherefore passed thou over to fight against the children of Ammon, and didst not call us to go with thee? We will burn thine house upon thee with fire. And Jephthah said unto them, I and my people were at great strife with the children of Ammon, and when I called you, ye delivered me not out of their hands. And when I saw that ye delivered me not, I put my life in my hands, and passed over against the children of Ammon, and the Lord delivered them into my hand. Wherefore then are ye come up unto me this day to fight against me? Then Jephthah gathered together all the men of Gilead, and fought with Ephraim. And the men of Gilead smote Ephraim, because they said, Yea, Gileadites are fugitives of Ephraim among the Ephraimites and among the Manassites. And the Gileadites took the passages of Jordan before the Ephraimites. And it was so that when the Ephraimites which were escaped said, Let me go over, the men of Gilead said to them, Art thou an Ephraimite? And he said, Nay. Then said they unto him, Say now Shibboleth. And he said, Shibboleth, for he could not frame to pronounce it right. Then they took him and slew him at the passages of Jordan, and there fell at that time of the Ephraimites 40 and 2,000. And Jephthah judged Israel 6 years. Then died Jephthah the Gileadite, and was buried in one of the cities of Gilead. So this goes on and on. I'm not sure I want to read the whole Bible here. Preparations for the temple, the master workmen, the two great pillars. In conclusion, let's just skip to the conclusion and not read another page of it, because you can go read those passages in the Bible yourself. In conclusion, from all the foregoing, it is therefore to be seen that a knowledge of the Bible and its place in Masonic history, jurisprudence, and ritual is indispensable for all who aspire to true insight into the deeper significance of Masonic thought. In a broader sense, it may be said that the familiarity with the Scripture is in fact essential to a well-rounded, moral, intellectual, spiritual, and cultivated life. For these reasons, many lodges have long made a practice of presenting to each newly made Mason his own copy of the Great Light. This custom has grown apace. By way of recapitulation, the considerations leading to the practice may be summarized as follows. 1. The most sublime teaching of Freemasonry are based upon or derived from the teachings of Holy Writ. 2. More than 100 references to the Bible can be traced in the ritual of ancient craft masonry alone. 3. The oldest legends and noblest allegories of Freemasonry are inextricably intertwined with Old Testament history and phraseology. 4. From time immemorial, initiates into Freemasonry have taken their vows of obligation upon the Holy Bible or some part of it. 5. Objectively, the Bible is one of the 3 greatest symbols of the fraternity. 6. Subjectively, the Bible is the rule and guide for a Mason's faith and practice, containing as it does those principles of morality which lay the foundations upon which to build a righteous life. 7. The Holy Bible must be opened in due form and kept open throughout the entire time when a Masonic lodge is performing regular Masonic work. 8. No regular Mason may lawfully be present in any lodge engaged in Masonic work unless the volume of the sacred law is opened on his altar. 9. Failure to require the open Bible in any lodge or grand lodge is prima facie evidence of unlawful or clandestine Masonry. 10. This requirement has come to have all the binding force of the ancient landmarks or basic unrepealable laws of Freemasonry. By putting the Book of Books into a new brother's hand, the Freemasonry seeks, in the strongest possible manner, to impress upon him the dignity and seriousness of the relationship he has assumed toward this time-honored fraternity. Good brethren and fellows, innumerable, who have gone this way before him, have respected the volume of the sacred law, have venerated it, have loved it, have found peace and comfort and hope and light and understanding within its blessed pages. The end. The Oxford Self-Pronouncing Bible, containing the Old and New Testaments, translated out of the original tongues and with former translations, diligently compared and revised by His Majesty's special command, appointed to be read in churches, authorized King James Version. And there's some Latin. Domina inustio illumea cum privilegio, published for Board of General Activities, Grand Lodge, New York, by Oxford University Press, New York. And the page is a little sticking together here. Oh my goodness, the pages are fused together. And then it's got some prelude, which I'm sure you can find in it. I'm just fascinated that the pages are fused together. It's like no one ever read this book before, and they never unfused these pages. So I'm going to rip them apart right now, unfortunately. Maybe not in the best way, maybe not in the way that it should be done. Probably destroying some, book that's worth $2. To the Most High God, to the Most High and Mighty Prince James, by the grace of God, King of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, defender of the faith. Wow, King of France. The translators of the Bible wish grace, mercy, and peace throughout Jesus Christ our Lord. And so this, I guess, is the preface to the King James Version that says, "Hey, King James, we dedicate this Bible to you. You're an awesome dude." And I don't feel like reading that. But, yeah, now we finally got to Genesis. And so the rest of it's just a Bible. But how many, oh, we got some stuff in the back here. Illustrations. The gods of Egypt. So there's actually a lot of explanation in the back, showing you some hieroglyphics, showing you some pictures here of some dudes, some hieroglyphics. Ptah, the creator, Amen, father of the gods, the sun god, Thoth. I don't know why all these Egyptian gods. Doesn't the Bible say, like, don't make idols of gods, and like you're adding on to the Bible like all these depictions of idols? That's an interesting contradiction there. But we got some Egyptian gods. And we were just looking at the pictures here. I didn't know there were pictures at the end. I almost closed the thing. The procession of Roman soldiers sacking the temple in Jerusalem. Then we have a section for notes. Then we have sort of a map here. Nice little map at the end. of the Middle East, Italy, Egypt, Arabia, Iran. Then it breaks it down specifically to Israel, showing the extent of Israel, showing the conquest of Israel across the River Jordan, showing it at the, Solomon's Temple, the various empires, the Assyrian and Babylonian empires, the Persian and Greek empires. What other kind of empires do we have? The Roman Empire. Lots of maps, actually. The Mediterranean lands at the time of the New Testament, the Roman Empire in the 1st century after Christ, which I'm not sure is entirely accurate as a map, but there you go. The land of Galilee. And that's the end. So we read quite a little bit today. That might give you some insight. I always think it's interesting to actually have the physical thing rather than just read a PDF off that's probably the more efficient thing, is to read the PDF off the internet. But just an interesting thing that popped into my possession to give people an insight of Freemasonry as a post-religious or meta-religious or trans-religious framework. It's not an anti-religious framework, and you could even say it has some perennial characteristics in the way that it describes the Bible as one interpretation or one approaching to divinity. But clearly, Masonry is not an atheist, secularist, anti-religious project necessarily. It's something that's very interested in religion. It's not like New Atheism, which says that religious works are hogwash and it's worthless and it's mind poison and it's terrible and we just need to burn it all, which is or we need to insult it, or burn the Quran, that sort of thing. Now that's not really what the perspective here in 1928 was. The perspective is much more, go get into esoteric Christianity, get past the surface level analysis and see the transcendent parts here, and kind of make a cult within a cult. If we call Christianity a cult, then within that they're trying to form Masonry as a secondary cult, a cult which says doctrine and dogma are not so important. What's important is the functions that doctrine and dogma are supposed to fulfill. That's what's important. And those transcendent functions are what Masonry achieves or tries to achieve, tries to address, tries to seek out and codify and bring people into agreement and say, hey, look, your superficial dogma doesn't matter. What matters is the functioning of your conduct is in line with the deeper truth, not the superficial, not like, are you keeping kosher, but are you, speaking to that deeper level. And then the other thing that's striking is how it seemed to be a Judaizing body, in that it's the body of Freemasonry in the history that I read there, it seems to have a lot to do with the fact that all of a sudden the Bible became well known, it became well read, rather than just something that priests would read. Now it was something that everyone should read. And so there was a huge Judaizing effect there. There was a different approach toward the Jewish people, not Jewish people as opponents of Christianity. But you see this time and time again with St. Jerome. St. Jerome goes to the Jews and he says, hey Jews, how do you think we should translate the Bible? And they give him advice. And this happens every time they try to translate the Bible again. They go back to the Jews, and there's this Jewish influence, and there's this respect for Jews and reverence for Jews, and viewing them as a race of geniuses, a race of religious geniuses, a race that rightly views other surrounding races as half-caste. That's kind of the racial language that they use in Freemasonry. So there is this importance put upon the Jewish people as the founders of Freemasonry, and that everything goes back to the Jews Not just in terms of, oh, well, that was the old covenant, now we have the new covenant. Freemasonry does not invalidate the old covenant. And so when people talk about the dual covenant theology as opposed to supersessionism, which is the traditional Christian view, that the old covenant passed away and there's a new covenant now, Freemasonry, to me, is where, people talk about Bibles in the early 20th century that put in commentary, and I'm forgetting the names of them right now, it doesn't matter. But I think Zionism, political Zionism, the idea that we have to get the Jews back into the land of Israel to fulfill these promises of God or whatever, rather than get Christians into the land of Israel. Two very different objectives, very different goals, different theologies. It seems to me that Christian Zionism or British Israelism was not invented in the 20th century or the 19th century, but actually it's invented with Freemasonry, which does not view the Jewish tradition as invalid. In fact, it views the Jewish tradition as just as valid, if not more valid, than the Christian tradition. So it's interesting. It's sort of an evangelical, esoteric, secret society of Goyish people who, or non-Jewish people who want to be Jews or who want to be part of the Jewish program in a deeper way than just converting to Christianity. For them, converting to Christianity is not sufficient. At the same time, they're not advocating converting to Judaism either. So they're saying it's not the dogma which is important. They're trying to get past that, trying to get to some deeper truth of some esoteric meaning behind the symbols of Judaism, rather than just emulating the rites, coming up with this new perennialist, pan-religious rite that Muslims and Hindus and Jews and Christians can all practice to get at the original meaning of the Jewish race and their religious genius. So it is kind of a idolization of Jews that comes long before even the concept of political Zionism. But what I think actually is where political Zionism comes from, where the concept of Jewish emancipation comes from in Napoleonic France, in Germany, 1848. Masonry, a lot of the early nationalists were Masons, so Mazzini, Wilhelm Marr, Wagner was associated. A lot of these, Bruno Bauer, I'm thinking a lot of people in Switzerland. The concept of doing something wrong religiously and fleeing to Switzerland is a very old tradition in Europe, so they were obviously doing it. I read about, I think it was Tyndall fled to Switzerland. A lot of British people fled to Switzerland to escape persecution. It was sort of like the America of that time, back in the early 16th century. And Wilhelm Marr and Bruno Bauer and others fled to Switzerland as well to escape German conservative policing of speech. And they formed secret societies there, some of which were Masonic, some of which were quasi-Masonic. And they talk about irregular Masons, Masons who don't use the Bible. So Masonry is bigger than just what I described here. They're giving you the sort of biblical version of Masonry, but there is a non-biblical version, or a version which doesn't include the Bible very much at all. Not to say that it excludes the Bible, but just that what I've described to you and the nationalist movements that created the German nation state, that even perhaps created the English nation state as we know, or the British Empire, created the French nation state, created Napoleonic France, the French Republic. All these countries that we know today, in their form, their nationalism was heavily influenced by Freemasonry. And Freemasonry is an attempt to get to the essence of Judaism, not converting to Judaism, but to distill its essence and to get back to that original wisdom without doing it through dogma, creating a new universal rite that can be practiced by people from all religious backgrounds, a secret society, esoteric perennialist society, going, and there was mention of Pythagoras as well. So when you think of nationalism, where does nationalism come from? Okay, well, ethnocentrism, you could say that's natural, you could say that's instinctive, intuitive, but at the same time, world historically, that process that led to political nationalism, nationalism as a political force, nationalism as a political movement, nationalism as an organizational club of people who work to create institutional change away from multi-ethnic monarchies to be mono-ethnic nation states, that has roots in Freemasonry. So, I don't know. I think that's enough for today. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.